We're going to jump into this pretty quickly, but I want to tell you just a few other things about Len. One, sort of at the most macro level, there are very few people I believe are great newspaper editors, not only of our times, but of past times. Ben Bradlee was certainly one, but you're here with another one, Len Downey, so welcome.
That's very kind, thank you.
To give you one quick statistic, today happens to be the day every year that the Pulitzer Prizes are announced, and the Washington Post won 2 Pulitzer Prizes today. One for the coverage of Roy Moore in Alabama, and the other shared with the New York Times for Russian interference in our elections. During his time as executive editor at the Washington Post, which covered 17 years after he was Ben Bradlee's managing editor, the Washington Post won 25 Pulitzer Prizes under Len Downey. That's the most Pulitzer Prizes ever overseen by a single editor. Len left the Washington Post and is now at Arizona State University, where he's the Weil Family Professor of Journalism. He is the author of 6 books and currently is starting work on his memoir, including doing research here at the Ransom Center. And you can look for that on Amazon, which will really drive the president crazy, as soon as 2000?
No, 2020.
2020. I'm sorry, 2020. Excuse me.
Okay. One hopes.
Yes, 2020.
Right.
Okay, we'll jump right in here with Ben's words at the beginning of the documentary, which were, "People lie a lot in Washington." And we saw in the documentary how that fueled Watergate, and Len was an editor of much of the Watergate coverage. But can you talk about how sort of Ben's, I think Bob Kaiser used the term bête noire,
right,
about lying sort of infused a lot of what Ben did?
It was really, he hated lying, and he hated lying particularly in public life. He hated lying to the American people. The truth was extremely important to Ben. In fact, he had planned to write one more book about lying, had done a lot of work on it. He made many speeches about lying in Washington, and he wanted to write a book about it because he just felt so strongly that it was so important for the people in power to tell the truth to the American people, and he felt the same way about the newspaper as well, and to be completely straight about it. When he came to the Washington Post in 1965 to be Kay's first managing editor and then executive editor soon afterwards, he changed the structure of the Post because previously a man named Russ Wiggins, who really was a terrific editor, was in charge of both news gathering and the editorial voice of the paper. There was no separation between opinion and news gathering, and the paper's primary reputation was built on the fact that it was very much anti-McCarthy during the McCarthy era, which was very noble, but at the same time it led the paper to have a reputation of being very liberal, and in fact conservatives called it the Pravda on the Potomac. And Ben was determined to make sure that that stopped, that the paper would be completely non-ideological, and so he insisted on only being in charge of the news gathering, as it is today still, and that the editor of the editorial page would be somebody else and would report separately to the publisher, and that's the way it's been ever since.
So there was obviously a lot of lying going on during Nixon, but the Washington Post now, the fact checker column, actually tries to keep track of the current president and what they calculate as the number of false or misleading claims. And I looked at it, the most recent number was, as of the beginning of March, 2,436. So how, as an editor, whether you're Ben Bradlee, Len Downey, or Marty Baron, do you try to work in the environment in which just sort of the velocity of false claims is so high?
Well, I want to go back to the beginning of fact-checking because, in fact, it started at the Post. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, had a habit, in fact, he admitted as much, of telling stories. And quite often the stories would turn out not to be true or to be elaborated on, but more often not even true. And so often in his press conferences and his speeches, there would be these untruths. And we decided we ought to be telling our readers what's fact and what's not fact and what the President of the United States says. And so we started to have we didn't call it fact-checking then. It was I can't remember exactly what we called it, but a kind of sidebar story to the main news story about the president, what the president said, that said what was true and what was not true. And it was interesting because as time went on, and as opposition grows to any president, there was opposition to Ronald Reagan as well. We would be accused of not holding his feet to the fire about telling the truth. And I said, well, we ran these stories all the time, but people never really paid attention to him because he was just so popular and so charismatic. And so that's how we started doing this fact-checking. And what concerns me now, I was in the age, obviously, before the internet. And what concerns me now is that it's just so difficult for people to sort out fact from fiction and everything that they see on the internet, everything that they hear on cable television, neither of which existed back at the time of Watergate, for example. The fact-checking is extremely important, I still think, but is not necessarily paid attention to.
We were talking, there's interesting parallels between what an editor like Marty Barron, the current editor of the Post, says now and what Ben said in the documentary, which is even in that kind of climate, your role is not to be at war with the president. It's to do your job as a journalist.
Yes, you cannot become angry about being attacked, and Ben was mercilessly attacked. As strong as the attacks now are on the fake New York Times, the fake Washington Post, et cetera, the attacks on Ben were personal. Ron Ziegler was often using, as you saw once, but many, many times, Ben's name, calling him a Kennedy lover, an enemy of the president, and so on. The President of the United States himself would attack the press. Well, the only difference is that what we now hear, we now see in the president's tweets about the press currently was what Richard Nixon was saying in the White House itself, but we didn't know what he was saying until the tapes were finally released. But you saw how his attitude towards the press was very similar.
Let's turn to President Kennedy. So it had been known that Ben Bradlee was neighbor of the Kennedys, close to the Kennedys. But to what degree did what we saw tonight, to what degree were you and others aware of that?
Well, Ben wrote about it, of course. He wrote about it in his autobiography, A Good Life, and he wrote about it in a book called Conversations with Kennedy, which at the time was pretty shocking to people because he revealed a lot about their relationship in that book that people hadn't known. And yet all of us who knew Ben well, who read both of those books, who talked with Ben about this issue because he would come up with other private lives of other public figures later on, Gary Hart and so on, we're shocked. We're shocked by what we saw in a lot of that footage. We're shocked by just how close it was with the Kennedys in their private lives. And while Ben had a recognition of this in the back of his mind, I think one of the people interviewed sort of said this. He knew what was going on, but God damn it, he loved it, and he just didn't want to stop. So, but it still was just. I'm always uncomfortable during those parts of this movie.
So for those of you, as a little background, when Len was executive editor, he didn't even vote because, and I'll let you explain why.
Yes, well, and I'm being attacked for this right now in a book by a New York Times reporter who strongly disagrees with me. I decided when I became, when Ben made me managing editor in 1984, pretty much as you saw about how he was beginning to check out of his working life and concentrate more on his private life, and rightly so, he had earned it. He put me in charge of the daily newspaper. He was still there. We made joint decisions about personnel and budget and that sort of thing. And he was always somebody I could go to for difficult decisions to get his advice. But I was really making all the final decisions about the news. So I essentially I knew I was going to be doing that if I was able to succeed him for a long time, which turned out to be a quarter century. And so I decided then that I just did not want to make up my mind about who should be president of the United States, who should be mayor of Washington, whether taxes should go up or down. And if you're voting as a good citizen, you have to make those decisions in your mind. You have to decide that. And I did not want to decide that. I wanted to keep an open mind for all of, it's the final gatekeeper for coverage of the Post, to not vote. Became sort of infamous for that. There were people that thought that was silly. There were people who thought I wasn't really telling the truth about it. There was people that thought that meant that I had an empty head and couldn't make up my mind about things. But I was determined to keep as open mind as possible. It sort of comes naturally to me. It drives my wife crazy, who has strong opinions about things. She's sitting here in the audience. She's going to get after me about this later. I'm always saying, but did you think about this on the other side of the question, which drives her crazy, but that's the way my mind works.
So how did Ben essentially, for lack of a better word, overcome this and kind of carry on after it was known that he was so close to a president, even maybe not to this extent?
Well, fortunately, he wasn't editor of the Washington Post at that time, so that was a Newsweek issue, if you will. And unfortunately, Kennedy was dead, and so it didn't really come up. It came up only in making decisions about the private lives of public figures. And Gary Hart was the example of that. The Miami Herald famously, after Gary Hart said, "Follow me around and see if I'm really a womanizer," and they did, and they caught him with a woman. And after that, there was somebody gave us, I still to this day don't know who it was, I think we never knew who it was, gave us an envelope with a private detective's work in it. I just was reading this today at the Ransom Center, reading the actual document, which I'd never seen before, in which he had followed Gary Hart in Washington. We don't know who he was working for, and was able to see him go into a woman's house, and his car stayed there, and he stayed there until he came out early the next morning. And so that was, we had to decide, is that a story for the Washington Post? And you could tell that this was one of those moments where he had to reflect on his relationship with Kennedy. And he always insisted he never knew about the womanizing. He clearly was genuinely shocked about Kennedy's affair with his sister-in-law. That was a horrible thing for Ben. But you could just see that he had to sort of think about, how do you deal with these things now? And his times had changed. And his decision was, yes, we should write the story. And so we had the reporter who was working on the story call Gary Hart's press secretary, because Hart wasn't going to speak himself, and present the information we had and ask for his response. And as this document, another document I read today, shows the press secretary, when he told Gary Hart this, Hart said, "Is this never going to end? Let's go home." And then they informed the Washington Post he was dropping out of the race.
And in the documentary, we see Ron Ziegler trying to basically paint Ben as a partisan. So talk about, just sort of Ben as not that.
Absolutely. He had this personal relationship with Kennedy that was very compromising, I think, for his work. And Ben wouldn't disagree with that. He just wouldn't feel the same way about it. But he was completely non-ideological and completely open-minded about things. All of us, for a very long time, as we watched the Watergate story, the water get higher and higher in the White House up to Nixon's neck. For the longest time, we refused to believe, to think that it was possible the president was responsible, and it would cause the resignation of the president. And he was just as skeptical. He kept Bob and Carl's feet to the fire all the time to make sure is what we're publishing really accurate. He was completely nonpartisan in all his direction of the paper.
One of the most fascinating things about Len's memoir, when it does come out, will be the number of very difficult decisions he had to make as executive editor in terms of publishing national security secrets.
Yes.
Let's start with Ben and the Pentagon Papers. You were at the Washington Post at the time. Talk, I guess, first about what you feel like, and this was obviously somewhat portrayed in the movie The Post, were the key factors for Ben to make that decision, but then talk about subsequent decisions you were involved with Ben and sort of how he approached national security.
This is another thing about Ben. Ben is a patriot. I mean, he was a decorated Navy man in World War II. He nearly lost his life in World War II, and he was a strong patriot, and that was in the background of all of his thinking about these things. So with the Pentagon Papers, it did grow out of competition with the New York Times, but also about lying. The Pentagon Papers showed how administration after administration from top to bottom lied about the Vietnam War, every aspect of it, and the whole engagement in Vietnam to begin with. And so that was an easy decision to make. At that time, I was a young city editor in the Washington Post. I was across a relatively small newsroom at the time, not the newsroom you saw in Watergate, from the national staff. One of my reporters was actually Don Graham, because he knew he was going to inherit the newspaper, and he wanted to do every job at the newspaper. And he actually had been president of the Harvard Crimson newspaper. He was a good journalist. And so he was one of my reporters at the time, which is kind of ironic. And we were watching this going on essentially across the newsroom. And the sense that this was really an important, a very, very important time in American journalism, American democracy, of whether or not the government was going to be able to stop us from publishing something in advance. It was what's called prior restraint in legal. And the 6-3 Supreme Court decision was overwhelmingly wonderful for the newsroom and for journalism, because it meant that unlike any other country in the world, literally any other country in the world, the government cannot stop us in advance from publishing something, and never has tried to do it since then. So that was sort of the backdrop. And then during Watergate, I had come back to the newspaper from a leave of absence on a fellowship about a week after the break-in, and was a kind of editor in the newsroom between the editor who edited Bob and Carl and Harry Rosenfeld, the Metro editor. So in the chain of command, working all its way up to Bradlee. And gradually I became more and more involved in Watergate coverage until the hearings were held. I edited all the stories about the hearings, and then after that edited Bob and Carl directly until Nixon's resignation. And on the night of the resignation, Ben was going around the room saying no gloating, but it was more than that. Ben and Carl and Bob and I and others involved in the coverage didn't know what to say. We couldn't speak hardly, because this was not something we were eager for. It wasn't something we expected to happen. We didn't feel like gloating. We didn't feel like cheering. We realized that we were, we had played some role in this extraordinary historical event, and I think then that played a role in future decision making about national security. So there came a time in 1985 when I was a managing editor, only 2 years under Ben. And Bob Woodward, of course, and another reporter came up with a story about a man named Ronald Pelton, who worked for the NSA in a relatively low position, somehow had the secret, knew about the secret of the as I say, CIA, NSA, National Security Agency, that the National Security Agency had been able to somehow, with a contraption, bug the undersea cables of the Soviet Union's communications with their submarines. An extraordinary thing. And after he left the NSA, he sold that secret to the Soviet Union, along with other secrets. And he was arrested for that, but the government would not say what he was arrested for. He's charged with treason. They wouldn't say what it was about. And Bob, of course, found out what it was about. This was the secret. It's called IV Bills, was the code name for this operation. And the head of the NSA, in 6 different meetings with Ben and myself, argued for why we should not publish the story. William Casey, who was then the CIA director, had Ben and I meet him in the university club around the corner from the Washington Post, and threatened us with prosecution if we were to run the story. He had actually already gone to the Justice Department to say we should be prosecuted if we ran the story. And we just kept consulting people over and over. I mean, Ben was very concerned about doing something that didn't worry about going to jail, but something that would be ruinous for the Washington Post on the one hand, and actually harmful to national security, when all these experts kept telling us this. And President Reagan called Mrs. Graham at home to also urge her to make sure that we didn't run the story, and she told him that wasn't her decision, that was Ben's and mine. Finally, when we felt we were ready to do it, the NBC, the trial was just beginning, Ron Pelton's trial was beginning, and NBC on a Monday morning on the Today Show, in just a 3-sentence report on what the trial was going to be about, said it had something to do with something called IV Bells, spying on the Russians. And so we published our story 2 days later. And for me, that was a lesson, because I understood Ben's care, and I understood his patriotism, and I understood his worry about not really endangering national security. But we waited too long to make that decision. If we weren't going to publish, we should have not published, or we should have published sooner. So years later, when the CIA had these secret prisons in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, where they were holding and interrogating terrorist suspects after 9/11, and we now know also torturing some of them. A brilliant reporter named Dana Priest, I think she's now a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, found out what was going on in these secret prisons and prepared a really strong story about them, which included their locations. And she actually went to one of the countries, Poland, we now can say, where they were located, and actually interviewed people in Poland, officials in Poland about them. And again, the government was the CIA in this case strongly urged us not to run the story, said it would be harmful to national security, and particularly not mentioning the names of the 3 relatively new democracies in Eastern Europe where some of these prisons were located, because they figured that they would have to close them down if the populations of those countries figured out that this illegal activity was taking place there under United States auspices. And we wound up, I wound up with Don Graham going to the White House at the president's invitation, President George W. Bush, and in the Oval Office, and the Vice President Cheney was there, and the Director of National Intelligence, John Negroponte, was there. And the National Security Advisor was there, and the president laid out why this would be dangerous for us to publish this story, and so on. And Don told him it was going to be my decision, not his. And I told him I had made up my mind this would be the last meeting. We have to make up our minds one way or the other after this meeting, because this was now several weeks in which we were working on the story. I didn't want it to stretch into the 5 months that the Pelton case did. And so on the way out of the Oval Office, John Negroponte, who I knew previously from other things he did in Washington, put his arm around me, kind of a avuncular guy, put his arm around me and he said, "You're not going to name those 3 countries in Eastern Europe, are you?" And I realized that that was their bottom line, that they realized I was going to publish the story. We weren't going to wait any longer, but that I might be amenable to damage control in a sense. And I decided that it really was not necessary for our readers. The story made a huge impact anyway, because revealing what was going on there, and the 3 countries' names were not really important. Dana came up with the idea of saying 3 countries in 3 Eastern European democracies in place of the countries' names, and I accepted that and made that decision. I made many other national security decisions over the years too, always with that Ivy Bells thing, pardon the expression, ringing in my ears.
I'm going to ask a few more and then go to audience questions, and I'll repeat the question so folks on the live stream can hear. The documentary gives real shorthand to how the Washington Post went from what people felt was a fairly mediocre paper into what, when David Remnick said by the time he got there in the early 80s, was the hot paper that everyone wanted to go there.
Right.
What were sort of some of the key things that Ben did to make that happen?
Well, first of all, he was, as he says, a good life. He was lucky in that the Post was starting to make money in a big way, like many American newspapers. The 60s and 70s were the big money times for American newspapers. Advertising was rolling in, profits for 20% or more, and so there was plenty of money to work with. And he went on a hiring spree. He had a really good gut feeling for talent. Obviously, he also had friends in the business from his years at Newsweek. He knew some of the important. He knew that David Broder at the New York Times was a very promising political reporter who was very frustrated by working for the Times in the ways that Scotty Reston briefly talked about. And a guy named Dick Harwood was a really hot reporter at the Louisville Courier-Journal in Louisville, and so on all around the country, and just began bringing them in and giving them. Ben's philosophy was, which I adopted after I took over the paper, was hire people that are smarter and more talented you are and let them do their best work. And that's what we did, and that's what he did. And so there was a lot of freedom that was not present at places like the New York Times. So when a guy named Nick von Hoffman was hired by Ben to cover this, to join the other reporters in covering the civil rights movement, for example, von Hoffman was writing what amounted to essays about what was going on, what he saw in the South, that Ben put on the front page, which other papers hadn't done before, even before the style section got started. And then he invented the style section, and hired really talented people, many of them women, who had not had that kind of voice in journalism before, to do what was called a new journalism in the magazine world, in the Washington Post, and then it fed on itself, and talented people wanted to come, and they had ideas about what they wanted to do, and editors essentially said, "Yeah, we hired you to do what you want to do," instead of trying to fit into some straight-laced way the Washington Post was working.
So one word that I always associate with Ben Bradlee, and I knew him much later, but I think this characteristic sort of infused the newsroom I walked into, which was swagger.
Yeah.
And can you talk about sort of the upside and downside of swagger?
Well, the downside for me was when it became clear, when it became public that I would succeed Ben as executive editor in a year or two. I can't remember the timing. The Washingtonian, which was a widely read local magazine in Washington, did a really long profile of me, the headline of which was "Not Ben Bradlee," because I do not have swagger. But yes, and Ben hired people with swagger, and he palled around in the newsroom with the people that had swagger. And those of us that didn't have swagger appreciated that. And it kind of created an umbrella over us so we could do our other good work. It's interesting. Ben had a very short attention span. It's a really good example of why it was great to work for Ben and why he was able to get so many good people to do good work for him. So I did a lot of investigative reporting as a young reporter. I was doing it right after he arrived, in fact. I wrote a series of articles about the local court system, that criminal court that Ben had worked in. He sent me down there to see what was going on there because he knew it was a mess. And I wound up doing a 7-part series about what a mess that court was. And as a result, and the court was run by the federal government because it's in the District of Columbia. And they were embarrassed by how bad it was. And so they, after my series ran, they abolished the Court of General Sessions and created what is today the D.C. Superior Court. And I did a lot of other investigative reporting over 4, 5, 6 years before I was put on the city desk and headed to Don Graham. That Ben he wasn't that interested in it, but he knew it was important. And so as a result, I always knew that he had my back, and especially when I was doing a series of articles about other local savings and loan associations. Back in the 1960s, most mortgage loans in Washington were made by savings and loan associations, not so many of which exist anymore. And they were actually in the black community backing up people, real estate people who were making bad deals with blacks buying homes, so that pretty soon they would not be able to pay their mortgages, they'd lose their houses. That was the series I was working on. And one day I'm sitting at my desk, and Ben comes along and says, "What are you doing, kid?" And I started to give the same kind of long explanation I've been giving in answers to all your questions. And he stopped me, after 3 sentences and said, "Well, no, Ken, I don't want to hear any more." He said, "That's enough." He said, "I've just come out of my office. I just had in my office the presidents of the 8 largest savings and loans in Washington, and they said if we run your story, they're going to take all their advertising out of the Post." And then he paused, and I took a deep breath, like maybe I'll die. And he did this. "Get it right, kid," and walked away. We published the story, and only because I could not see the ads in the newspaper, they were gone, did I know that the advertising had all been taken out of the paper. And only because I did some investigative reporting in our accounting department did I know how many millions of dollars that cost the Post for an entire year. And nobody ever said boo to me about it. And so that's what Ben was about. Not terribly interested in what I was doing, but believed it was important and I should be encouraged to do it.
So I'm going to go to your questions, and raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's a lot of the talk early on about him and believing or trying to find the truth all the time. But as one who kind of lived through that time, and of course is still living now in this time, it seems like people value the truth differently now, or there's a different perception of what the truth is.
Well, not so much. I think the country was evenly divided over Nixon right up to the end. And there were lots of Washington Post haters and Nixon lovers right up to the end. They just didn't want to believe it, and then he was gone. And many, there's still, including some important people, still believe to this day he was a great president. And while he made a mistake, he shouldn't have been railroaded out of office. So it's not unusual to have people as divided as it is now. It was divided over the Vietnam War. In fact, the Washington Post, the news gathering part of the Washington Post was writing the stories that were raising issues about the Vietnam War. At the same time, the editorial page of the Post was supporting the Vietnam War. And so the country was that divided. I think the difference now is the internet, the digital world, where it's all around us so intensely, and cable television, where it's just so 24 hours, every minute of 24 hours. And and then I think that makes the passions higher and the divisions deeper. So I know that's a bit of a cockeyed optimism, but I lived through. I mean, I lived through the right in the middle. It's one thing to say about Watergate. The movie made it so glamorous. I know that it showed that the people were scared, when Bernstein got scared and so on, and Ben was worried, but it really made it so glamorous that what was really going on for the dozen of us that were the heart of the work on the Watergate story, it was a dark tunnel. It was a dark, scary tunnel. We knew we were being attacked all the time. We really did worry our phones were being bugged. Somebody tried to sell Bernstein marijuana in a street corner in downtown Washington. Thank God he didn't buy it, and so it was not glamorous, and yet we came out of that, and so I'm hoping that somehow we'll come out of this too. And I just want to emphasize what RB mentioned earlier, in that Marty Barron, who's the current editor of the Washington Post and a really great editor, really great editor of the Washington Post. He edited the Miami Herald and the Boston Globe. He was the editor of the Boston Globe when Spotlight occurred, when the investigation of the Catholic Church, and it was under his watch and his backing, and he's similarly strong at the Washington Post. He just like Ben during Nixon, he doesn't argue back. He just says we're doing our jobs. He's not going to argue with the current president's criticism of the Post, and that's the right way to behave. Right, right. Right.
Repeat the question first, so essentially, if I can summarize it, it's that a lot of people outside of Washington have a cynicism about the Washington press corps, saying you're trying to be watchdogs, but you're also kind of part of the establishment.
Yes, and that was a pet peeve of both Ben's and mine forever, and I think it's gotten a lot better, but it used to be worse. Carol Kilpatrick, the White House reporter for the Washington Post during the Truman administration, and he was a very good White House reporter in succeeding administrations also, played poker with President Truman in the Oval Office, at the desk in the Oval Office. That's how close it was. And then there are these stupid dinners, the White House Correspondents' Dinner and the Gridiron Dinner, which I always hated, except what we would do is we would bring sources to the dinner who might not otherwise talk to us very much, and that way you can sort of find out more from them over that dinner. But otherwise, this whole Hollywood on the Potomac thing is silly, and different. And while Ben was very social, he was not social in the sense that he was going to dinners with the sort of sources in Washington, or the people that we ought to be reporting on, with the exception of what we saw with the Kennedys at the time, but more the other kinds of fun sort of dinners. I didn't socialize hardly at all. I would only go to those events and dinners where I was positive that I would be being able to talk to people who I wanted to make sure that I knew what was going on, and maybe develop them as sources for the Post, but always to keep a distance. And in fact, as a result, I had no friends. And sometimes when a politician would think that they might become a friend of mine, we would publish a story that made them mad as hell, and that was the end of that. I had a very bad relationship with the Clintons, for example, because we were covering them so aggressively, and they expected we would be clubby, and they expected that we would be the liberal Washington Post, and we would be supportive of him. And when we kept investigating Whitewater and then Monica Lewinsky, I made the decision to publish Monica Lewinsky's name for the first time in the American news media, for example. They were livid about it. And I think that you're seeing less clubbiness now in Washington. Actually, what's happened is the same fracturing that's happened in the digital world, in that the New York Times and the Washington Post clearly are not clubby, and yet some other conservative folks are clubby with the conservative people and liberals with the liberal people. So it's really fractured. The one interesting thing, though, is that in this administration, unlike eventually in the Nixon administration, by the time the president was forced to resign, Bob and Carl's sources went all the way up in the Nixon White House, literally to Alexander Haig, the chief of staff for the president, which is why many of those people were wrongly supposed to be deep-throated, because people would hear that they probably were sources of Bob and Carl's. Similarly, in this White House, there's so much division and there's so much chaos that there's a lot of talking to the press, not because it's clubby, but because they're trying to influence the president. They're trying to save their jobs. They're trying to save the country. And so there's just a lot of that kind of stuff going on, which I find very interesting. And the Post has, in order to get away from this accusation that these anonymous sources aren't real, is now telling people this story is based on 12 sources, some of whom work in the White House, some of whom have been talking to people in the White House, et cetera, to give the readers a better idea that these are real people.
Time for a couple more? Okay, Robert.
Yeah, in 10 years that you've been out of the Post, you're kind of watching from academia now how we're doing. How are journalists doing covering this administration compared to like how you think journalism did in the like early 70s and the 80s? Are we doing as well, or have the shrinking budgets and the digital distribution?
Yeah, the shrinking budgets, unfortunately, I'm sorry. The question is about whether how's the press doing now in covering the government, with the shrinking budgets, the changing economics of the business, the shrinking newsrooms. The shrinking newsrooms, I'm afraid, have mostly affected local coverage. You can see it here in Austin, obviously, with what's happened to the Statesman American. In some cases, owners that are more interested in extracting what profits still exist in newspapers, rather than investing in the coverage. And I'm appalled by that. I'm absolutely appalled. The digital first media has been stealing from newspapers that they own around the country and ruining very good newspapers. Gatehouse media might be a little better, but I don't think that much better either. So far, the ones that are able to still invest in news are those that are now being bought by billionaires, like the Washington Post being bought by Jeff Bezos, by billionaires who believe that there should be good journalism and they're going to pay for it. And they're making it profitable. The Washington Post was not profitable when Don Graham sold it to Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos has found ways, mostly through great digital innovation, to make the Post profitable again while expanding its staff. So in terms of the coverage of the national government, I'm rather pleased with what's going on. There was a period where the shrinkage has mostly affected coverage of the workings of government, the individual agencies. Back in my day, we would have a reporter that covered the EPA and a reporter that covered every agency in the government. And that broke off for a while. Actually, because of what's going on in this government, the big changes from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, you actually are seeing coverage of those agencies now. We know what the EPA is doing now. We know what Justice is doing. We know what many of these agencies are doing. We didn't know before, the Energy Department and so on. And so I'm actually pleased by that. But I don't know how widespread in the newspapers around the country this Washington coverage is being done by people who come from those cities and report directly to those cities, as opposed to the national newspapers. But now, of course, everybody can read the national newspapers in their in these hometowns too. But in our day, the L.A. Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Detroit Free Press, they all had Washington correspondents and in covering these agencies, and now it's mostly coming from the national media.
Yes, thank you for this, sir. You're a big hero to me, and Ben Bradlee was a big hero to me as a new indie journalist at 60.
That's very nice.
Let me ask you this. I've been thinking about the best way to frame it without mentioning names. I get the fact that there's no one better to speak to you. You have such a long career on seeing very fractious times in American journalism. But right now, I still feel a very particularly in television journalism, there's only one guy I can watch that I can't imagine I ever would have watched him before, right? Which is like Clay Gaines, if you guys know what I'm talking about. But right now, I see a president that is so unpopular. There's a large section of the neoliberal establishment that has failed this country in a big way that wants to unseat him. And they will do it by any means necessary. That cannot happen. This, to me, I'll start off with, I guess I'm saying, if you could channel Mr. Bradlee somehow, how would he handle this in a way? You've already given a clue, which I think is correct, in how you made this step that annoys your wife, where you try to stay so. You see that your mind works in a certain way. You don't want to pollute it by getting yourself caught up in the political, the tribalism.
I can tell you that Marty Barron, the current editor of the Washington Post, is not caught up in it whatsoever. That coverage is not a neoliberal plot to unseat the president. It is trying to hold the president accountable. That's what we do, and that. Well, I'm not going to comment. That's not my job, and although again I see quite a variety in television too.
Len, I will offer something. You know, there's some slight parallel between newspapers before they decided to kind of be straight down the middle. There was a real history of
Yes.
papers with all kinds of partisan.
Yes.
And I think that's what television, it's a business model as much as anything else.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. Some of what you're seeing that's obnoxious on television is for ratings. And and it's interesting that Jeff Zucker, who now runs CNN, saw ratings in having Trump on all the time during the campaign, much more than Hillary Clinton, and now has stuff on all the time that's critical of Trump. But because that's good for his ratings, as opposed to Fox News's ratings, which are supportive of Trump.
So I'm going to bring us to close with one last thing, and I'm going to ask you to sort of just tell people briefly about, for me, kind of what was the capper of the Ben Bradlee Times, which was I was in the newsroom when word started to spread, and Len was out of the office, that Deep Throat was going to be revealed. And the newsroom virtually stopped, and everyone was just a buzz of, is this true? Are we going to be there for that? And then eventually little hints started to appear, like a slug of a story. And then at some point by the end of the day, there was Ben Bradlee, there was Carl Bernstein, there was Bob Woodward. Just tell the story of like that, how that happened.
I'll try to make this brief because I love this story. Deep Throat was not known. His identity wasn't even known to Ben Bradlee until Richard Nixon resigned, because the Post never published anything that Deep Throat said in his say-so. He was a guide. He was a guide. He was that kind of source. But Bob and Carl would have to, anything that came from Deep Throat, they would have to find from other people before we would publish it, in more than one source and all the time, and Bob and Carl always had to write up most of their interviews were conducted on what's called deep background in journalism, which is to say they could use the information that they got, but they could not quote the person, they could not name the person, and you could only give a vague idea of who that person was, like senior administration official. Although often back then it was often just informed sources, which we've done better than that now. We've reformed from that now, but the confidentiality was guaranteed for life. So as long as you were alive, unless you released them from the pledge, it was going to be for life, and the sources began to mount up, as I said, and I knew all the sources who were not Deep Throat, because they had to put their names of each source at the top of the memos they had to do. All their interviews had to be typed out in memos to us, so that we could, in judging their stories, we could go back to those memos and make sure the stories were an accurate reflection of the information they were getting, the conclusions they were drawing were reasonable, and so on. And so I saw Alexander Haig's name and lots of other names of people that were thought to be Deep Throat over the years. So, and by the way, and the notes from Deep Throat were always said the tops had M period, F period, which Bob said stood for my friend. And the brilliant Ben Bradlee, the brilliant Len Downey, the brilliant Harry Rosenfeld never figured out that that stood for Markfeld. So, it's just great investigative reporters. So there came a time, and finally he told Ben, but nobody else. So there came a time when I decided, well, years have gone by, and I said, I ought to be able to figure out who Deep Throat is, because I knew who Deep Throat wasn't from all these other sources. So my first guess was Elliot Richardson, who was the acting attorney general who was fired in the Saturday Night Massacre because he wouldn't fire the special prosecutor. And I knew he wasn't one of these named deep background sources. So I thought, and he's a logical guy, and he would know what was going on in Watergate and so on. So I guessed Elliot Richardson, and this is the ghoulish part of this. I had to wait until he died for Bob to tell me that it was not Elliot Richardson. And then I guessed L. Patrick Gray, who, if you remember, was the acting director of the FBI during this period, and was fired by Nixon, and he would have access to all the FBI stuff. And he was a logical person, and I knew that he wasn't one of those named deep background sources because, in fact, he hadn't talked to Bob and Carl at all. And so I guessed L. Patrick Gray, and unfortunately, I had to wait until he died, and then Bob would tell me, no, it's not L. Patrick Gray. So I figured I only get 3 strikes in this ball game because it's so embarrassing since I have this great advantage. And so I wrote down, I thought carefully, and I thought, it's not Elliot Richardson, not L. Patrick Gray. Oh, that's right, Mark Felt. He was the number 2 in the FBI then. He was number 3 in the FBI when I was an editor of investigator stories and actually talked to him a couple times for things I wanted to check out. And he seemed like a reasonable guy in the FBI, seemed kind of smart. And he's not one of those other name sources. So this time I wrote down his name on a piece of paper, put it in a sealed envelope, and gave it to Bob. And I said, when Deep Throat dies, please open this envelope and tell me if there's a person inside it. Meanwhile, Bob is very generous in speaking on college campuses right to this day for no fee, anywhere around the country. And he would always be asked about Deep Throat, and he would always say, I can't tell you. I promised him, I made this pledge, I would not reveal his identity as long as he was alive. And then I heard that he was beginning to say, well, Deep Throat is very ill, and it's possible that he'll die relatively soon, and then you'll know who he is. And I called Bob into my office, and I said, what's going on here? If he's near death, we have to prepare. We need stories. We have to fill pages of the Washington Post with who he was and what the relationship was and so on. And Bob is one of America's greatest journalists. He's a very manipulative person. Truthful, but manipulative. When he would come into my office and say, Len, you're just the best editor around, I would say, what in the hell do you want, Bob? And then I would find out what he really wanted. And so, like another book leave, So, so I said, what's going on here? I mean, you're not being responsive to what I'm saying. He said, well, I've written a book about my relationship with Mark Felt, with Deep Throat. He didn't say Mark Felt, with Deep Throat. And when he dies, I want to publish it. I said, Bob, that's terrific. I'm glad that you want to publish that book when he dies. First, anything I want in that book is going to be in the Washington Post. I want to see the book. And Bob is also, while being manipulative, dutiful to authority. And so he had me out to his house in Georgetown for breakfast the next morning or the morning after. And he pulls out the manuscript, and there on the first page, it's Mark Felt. And he did prepare all the stories we wanted to have prepared. At the same time, Mark Felt's family, particularly his daughter Joan, and I was just reading about this again, too, in the archive here today with the memos and things I hadn't seen before, wanted to have her father's role known before he died. And she wanted money out of it. She figured there would be money in that. And so she tried to persuade Bob to talk to her father and persuade her father to allow Bob to name him as Deep Throat. Bob went out to see him, took him to lunch, and realized he just was not competent enough to make that decision in good faith. And so Bob decided, no, I'm not going to do it. So the family's lawyer, who also happened to be something of a writer, was persuaded by the family, and he claims he got Mark Felt's permission to do this. To this day, who knows if he did or didn't, published a story in Vanity Fair about unmasking him as Deep Throat. And now we're in digital times, so they also put it up on their website at 10:30 in the morning on a day when the senior editors of the Post were at what we called Pugwash, an annual editors retreat. In this case, I was my retreat, and I was holding it in the eastern shore of Maryland, in a resort there. And the meeting room that we're in, everybody's around a table, and then there's this glass wall to the outside world, and outside the glass wall is a patio. And I'm droning on about something. I'm making a presentation to the group about something. And everybody's cell phone starts to go off, including mine. And I just turn it off, even though when Pat O'Shea, my terrific executive assistant, calls me, I probably should answer the phone. I didn't. And everybody else turns their phone off. But when Don Graham's phone rings, and he's sitting across the room from me, he decides he better answer it because he knows he wouldn't be interrupted unless it was important. And Don Graham is a Boy Scout. Don Graham does everything right. And so the right thing to do was answer that goddamn phone. So he goes out into I can see him out on the terrace, and he's talking on the phone, and all of a sudden he does this to me. And I go out on the terrace, and it's Woodward telling me what Vanity Fair has just done, and saying, and arguing that just because Vanity Fair has done this, he can't do it because he's still got his agreement with Mark Felt, and Felt has not released him from it. I said, Bob, it's over. I'm coming to the paper right now. Get ready. We're going to do this. And while I was driving in at speeds that ought to have had me arrested to the Washington Post, Ben comes downstairs from upstairs where he had his office as the vice president at large of the Washington Post, and Carl gets on a plane and flies down. So they're all there by the time I get there, and I told Ben why we need to go ahead, and he agreed. And then I called Bob into my office and I said, we just got to do this, and so we did. So we started publishing on the web and published a whole bunch of pages in the Post the next day, and then the following day essentially published Bob's book in the Washington Post. And then he published the book himself, and it still made money.
All right, so please join me in thanking Len Downing.